Jake stood at the kitchen counter, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. The faint smell of toast lingered in the air, but it did nothing to warm the chill that had settled in his bones. It was a Sunday morning, one of those rare moments when everything seemed peaceful. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the low tick of the clock on the wall were the only sounds. This was my Saturday morning dinner with my wife. In 15 minutes, Lily would be up and ready to go. They had a routine, a rhythm that had been years in the making, but today something felt different. Oh, Arrow knew it too. He didn't say a word, but Lily felt the grind of the wheels. For the past few weeks, Jake had noticed subtle changes in Lily. She was always a bit distant, but now there was a sharpness to it, an air of secrecy he couldn't ignore. Her phone had become a permanent fixture in her hand. Her smile seemed forced. And when he tried to hold her hand at night, she recoiled. Not in disgust, but in a way that suggested she wasn't, well, she was a patient man by nature. And it gnawed at him, and though he was a patient man by nature, the notifications seemed almost less frequent, and not an improvement. It gnawed at him because the society overall wasn't easing to welcome. Jane, the phone had been going off for the past few weeks. People was a lot of feelings. If I only knew where to find him, it might provide a little clarity. He took a slow sip of his coffee, staring out the window at the quiet street. His mind replayed the moment when he first noticed something was off. It had been a Thursday, a week before, when she'd told him she was going to a spa for a self-care day. Jake had been busy at work and didn't think much of it at first, but something in the way she said it, the slight hesitation in her voice, made him uneasy. She had kissed him goodbye, her lips soft, but her eyes, those eyes, were too quick to turn away. There was something he didn't trust about it. It wasn't like him to second-guess her. Over the years, he'd always trusted Lily. She had been his rock, his partner in everything. But trust, as he was beginning to understand, could be fragile. A small crack in the foundation was enough to make everything tremble that morning. Instead of heading to work, Jake had followed her. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was the feeling that something in their life, something he couldn't quite put his finger on, was beginning to slip away. He had kept a safe distance, staying far enough behind to avoid detection, but close enough to see where she went. She had driven to a hotel on the outskirts of town. Not the kind of place anyone would expect a spa day to be. It was a small, nondescript hotel, the kind where the blinds were always drawn and the parking lot was half empty. She had gone inside, her figure disappearing through the glass doors. Jake had stood there for a long moment, a sense of dread creeping into his chest. The entire world seemed to shrink down to that one defining moment. Was this really happening? Was his marriage, the life they had built together, unraveling right before his eyes? And Jake had left before she saw him. He didn't confront her. That wasn't how he worked. Instead, he'd driven home, his mind spinning with questions. What was going on? Was there someone else? What's wrong? The unease continued to gnaw at him as the days passed. Lily had returned later that evening, her eyes too wide, her smile too bright. It felt rehearsed. And yet, he said nothing. Not yet. He wasn't ready to confront her. He needed more. Proof. He needed her to slip. Just enough so there could be no denying it. Jake's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. The creak of the floorboards told him Lily was awake. He took a deep breath, wiped his hands on a dish towel, and placed his coffee mug in the sink. His chest felt heavy, but he didn't let it show. When she entered the kitchen, her hair was still damp from the shower, and she wore that same carefully curated smile. "Good morning, love," she said softly, her voice bright but hollow. Jake nodded, meeting her gaze with calm resolve. Morning. He knew she wasn't expecting this. She wasn't expecting him to have any suspicion, but it was there, like a silent storm brewing just beneath the surface. And Jake wasn't sure how much longer he could pretend it wasn't. The days that followed Lily's spa day felt like they moved in slow motion, each passing hour thick with tension. Jake's mind raced, but he kept up his routine, pretending everything was normal. He worked long hours at the construction firm, the weight of a little fall of responsibility anchoring him in a world far from the growing storm in his home. Yet every time he walked through the door, his heart would tighten at the sight of Lily, her demeanor unchanged, her smiles polished but empty. Lily had always been a picture of grace, a woman who could make any room feel brighter with her presence. But now, it was as though the light in her had dimmed. She still dressed well, still maintained the image of the loving wife, but there was something hollow behind her eyes, a vacancy that Jake couldn't ignore. He knew something had shifted, but the deeper truth eluded him, and who knew? The more he observed her, the more the pieces started to fall into place. There were little things, things that didn't belong in the fabric of their life. For one, her phone had become an unspoken boundary. She was always careful with it, keeping it close, never leaving it unattended. If she was in the other room, it was locked, even though they had never had a need for such things in the past. It wasn't unusual for Jake to check his phone in front of her, to share every little detail of his day, but now he had to ask for her password just to check the weather. At first, it told himself he was being paranoid. After all, people change. Lily had always been a woman who thrived on attention, on admiration. He had known that when he married her. She had a magnetic quality, a charm that drew people in. But there was a fine line between wanting admiration and needing validation to feel alive, and lately it seemed as though Lily was feeding an insatiable hunger for something he couldn't provide. Jake remembered how they used to talk for hours. They had once shared everything, their hopes, their fears, the small, seemingly insignificant details that made their life together. But now, conversation felt like an exercise in restraint. When they spoke, it was only about the mundane things, the groceries, the bills, the kids' school schedules. The intimacy, the connection they once shared was slipping through his fingers like sand. Sophia, his sister, had noticed too. She was the first to bring it up, though she hadn't said much, just a knowing glance when they spoke on the phone. Sophia had always been the no-nonsense type, the one who didn't sugarcoat things. Jake, what's going on with you two? You're not the same. She's not the same. Jake had brushed it off at first, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized she was right. Something was off. It wasn't just a passing phase or a bit of distance. It felt deeper, more deliberate. And the more Jake observed, the more he came to one painful conclusion. There was someone else. His suspicions turned to certainty one fateful afternoon when Lily mentioned her upcoming spa weekend with her best friend, Rachel. It seemed innocent enough until Jake picked up on a slip of the tongue, a small, almost imperceptible detail that made his heart skip a beat. Lily had mentioned the spa's name, and Jake had heard it before. Not from her, but from Rachel. She had mentioned it months ago, in passing, when they had all been at a dinner party together. Rachel had made a joke about how expensive it was, and how Lily had always wanted to go. But Rachel had also said something else. It's funny, she'd said with a smile. I don't know why Lily needs a spa weekend. She never really takes time for herself. It's always about the family. Jake's gut twisted. Why was she going alone now? Why not with Rachel? The more he thought about it, the clearer the picture became. Lily was lying, and Jake knew it. She had made plans to meet David again, and this time it wasn't just a fleeting moment of weakness. It was a pattern. That evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Jake stayed awake, sitting in the dim light of their living room. He didn't confront her yet. He needed evidence, something irrefutable. But the truth was gnawing at him now, relentless and insistent. He'd seen the change in her, the way she looked at him sometimes, as though he were a stranger or a character in a story that had lost its plot. There was a growing sense of betrayal that filled his chest, an ache so sharp he could barely breathe. It wasn't just the affair. It was the years of trust that had been casually tossed aside. The life they had built was nothing more than a fragile house of cards, teetering on the edge of collapse. Next morning, Jake made a decision. He wouldn't let her control the narrative anymore. He would expose her, but not out of anger. No, he was past that. He wasn't going to confront her in a fit of rage to throw accusations at her and watch her squirm. He would do this on his terms, methodically, with cold precision. Jake wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of an emotional explosion. He was going to destroy her carefully, strategically, so that there would be no room for denial. She would have no choice but to face the truth. The days passed in a blur, and Jake began to put his plan into action. He quietly followed her again, noting her every movement, every glance. His patience, the very thing that had once made him a steady, dependable man, was now a tool he would use to dismantle the life she had so carefully constructed. The pieces were falling into place, and the storm was coming. Jake hadn't planned on spying on her again, but the seed of suspicion had taken root, and the need for clarity gnawed at him like an animal trapped in a cage. There was a quiet rage inside him now, one that he had never known in himself before. He had always been the patient one, the one who let things play out, who believed that time would reveal all truths. But now, each day that passed with Willie's lies hanging in the air like a thick fog pushed him closer to the edge. That afternoon, after another long day at work, Jake found himself standing in front of the mirror, adjusting his shirt. His reflection stared back at him, tired, worn, but with an edge in his eyes that wasn't there before. He wasn't the man he used to be, the man who would shrug off a small deviation in his marriage and move on. No, something had shifted. And though he didn't fully understand it yet, Jake knew one thing for sure. The life he thought he knew was crumbling. Lily had been acting strange all morning, fidgeting with her phone, avoiding eye contact, almost as if she were preparing to leave. She had told him she was meeting Rachel for lunch, another excuse he'd heard too many times before. Jake had learned over the years how to read her in ways that no one else could. There was a small tick, a way her jaw clenched whenever she was about to lie. He'd noticed it years ago when she had a habit of trying to hide something she knew would upset him. But this time, it wasn't a small thing. This time, the lie had the weight of betrayal behind it. He had told her he needed to pick up a few things from the hardware store, an errand that would give him a window of opportunity, but instead of heading straight to the store, Jake parked down the street from their house and waited. His mind raced with thoughts of confrontation, of exposing her right then and there. But he kept his resolve. No, this needed to be done carefully. He would not give her the satisfaction of making him react in anger. Second thoughts. He would take control of the narrative. An hour passed, and then he saw it. The familiar car. Lily's. It wasn't Rachel she was meeting. Rachel didn't drive that particular make of car. And when Lily parked in front of the hotel again, Jake's stomach twisted in a way that was all too familiar, like the sensation of a punch landing in the gut. He wasn't surprised, but the reality of it hit him like a freight train. She was here, with him. David. Jake's mind replayed their last meeting. David was charming, the type of man who could win over a room in seconds. He was athletic, outgoing, the kind of guy who had always seemed to have everything handed to him. Jake had never felt a real animosity toward him, never suspected anything. David was one of those guys who could talk his way out of anything, and Jake had always found him to be likable, if a bit too carefree. But now, all of that had changed. Now, David was the symbol of everything that was wrong, everything that had stolen the life Jake had once been proud of. Jake felt his pulse quicken as he watched Lily and David walk into the hotel. He didn't know what to do, what to feel. There was no more doubt. His marriage had been shattered by the hands of someone he trusted. And Lily? She wasn't the woman he had married. The woman he had married wouldn't do this, couldn't do this. But she had. For a long while, Jake sat in the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. His breath came in shallow bursts. He wanted to rush in, to confront them both, to walk into that hotel and throw the truth in Lily's face, to let her know he knew everything. But the cold part of him, the part that had been buried for years, told him to wait. Patience. That was his strategy. He pulled out his phone, the only thing that could give him some small semblance of control. His fingers moved almost mechanically as he began to record. Every detail mattered. Lily's arrival, David's presence, the way they spoke to one another. He needed evidence, proof that could not be denied. And in that moment, as his phone captured their interactions, a chilling realization settled in. Lily wasn't just playing with fire. She was burning their entire life to the ground. And Jake had no choice but to watch it all go up in flames. The hours passed like minutes. Jake's body had gone numb with the weight of the situation. When he finally saw them leave the hotel room and get into David's car, Jake's stomach churned with a mixture of disgust and sadness. They drove off together, but not before Jake had captured the most damning footage. The evidence that would ensure Lily had no escape from her betrayal. As he drove back home, the reality of what he had just witnessed began to sink in. His thoughts swirled, but one question refused to leave his mind. What now? Jake wasn't sure what he expected to feel. Anger? Yes. Hurt? Of course. But more than anything, he felt a strange sense of emptiness. All the years of loyalty, all the sacrifices, all the devotion he had given her, it had meant nothing. Lily's betrayal wasn't just about infidelity. It was about the death of everything they had built together. When he got home, Lily was sitting in the living room, her hair damp from the shower, a magazine in her lap. She looked up when Jake walked in, her eyes widening slightly. She was trying to play it cool, pretending that everything was fine, but Jake saw right through her. Had a nice lunch with Rachel? He asked, his voice calm, controlled. Yo. Lily nodded, forcing a smile. Yeah, we caught up. It was nice. Why? Jake said nothing. He wasn't ready to confront her yet, not this way. Instead, he walked into the kitchen, his mind already working through his plan. It wasn't just about the affair. It was about the way she had so easily shattered his trust, his respect. Jake had the evidence now. And that evidence would not be hidden, not buried in the depths of his pain. It would be shared with the world. As he stared out the window, watching the sun set on a day that felt like the end of an era, Jake knew what he had to do. This was only the beginning. The days that followed were a blur for Jake. He moved through the motions of his life as though everything was normal. But inside, he was a man on the verge of something inevitable. He had the evidence. He had everything he needed to expose the betrayal that had eroded the foundation of his marriage. And yet the decision of when and how to act weighed heavily on him. It was early in the morning when Jake made his first call. His sister, Sophia, had been the only person who seemed to understand the weight of what he was carrying. She had listened to him vent, to his anger and confusion, and she had urged him to take control, to stop allowing Lily to live in a fantasy. But Sophia also knew that Jake wasn't the type of man to react impulsively. He needed to feel justified, to know that the moment he struck, it would be with precision and without regret. You've got the evidence, Jake. Now it's about how you want to handle it. Sophia had said the night before, her voice steady, like the voice of someone who had lived through her own share of storms. You can't let her walk away from this without consequences. Not just for her, for you too. Don't let her take your dignity with her. I've also got here that a lot of times we aren't necessarily agreeing sometimes. Those words haunted him, and as Jake dialed her number, they echoed in his mind. Jake, Sophia said, her voice warm and familiar. What's your plan? Damn, I'm ready, he said flatly. Sophia paused. Jake could almost hear the wheels turning in her mind. She knew her brother, knew that he would never do anything rash, never act out of anger. But she also knew that this was a turning point, and she wouldn't let him back out now. Then what are you waiting for? She asked, her voice soft but firm. You've given her enough time. She's had her secrets. Now it's time for you to have yours. You do this on your terms, Jake. Expose her in a way that she can't deny. Don't let her control the narrative anymore. Jake felt a sharp breath catch in his chest. He had to let go of the anger, of the sense of betrayal that clung to him like a second skin. He had to remain calm, methodical, the way he had been taught to face adversity all his life. Revenge, real revenge, was not about fire and fury. It was about cold, calculated destruction. And that's exactly what he would give her. It was time. Jake didn't speak to Lily again for the rest of the day. She had gone to the gym, another routine she had developed in recent months. Jake could feel her absence in the house. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable. As soon as Lily's car pulled out of the driveway, Jake sat at the kitchen table, his phone in hand, the images and videos still fresh in his mind. His finger hovered over the screen. He knew what would happen next. He had already decided who would see this first. Rachel. Jake wasn't sure why he had chosen Rachel over other people in Lily's circle of friends, people who might have been more obvious to send it to. But something told him it had to be her. Rachel was the closest thing to a confidant Lily had, and Jake had known from the moment he had heard that slip-up about the spa weekend that Rachel had been a silent enabler in all of this. She had never fully trusted Lily's marriage to Jake, not in the way a best friend should, not in the way that protected the vows they had made. She had always encouraged Lily to take time for herself, to chase the excitement she thought was missing. Jake had no intention of giving Rachel the luxury of ignorance. He drafted a message to her, one that felt as impersonal as possible. He didn't want her sympathy or any further connection with Lily's lies. He simply attached the video and the photos, each frame cutting through the illusion Lily had so carefully crafted. I thought you should know what your best friend has been up to. She's been meeting with David. I have the proof. Don't let her lie to you anymore. Jake sent the message, feeling a brief pang of guilt, but it quickly dissipated. He had done everything to save this marriage, everything to be the man she had asked for. And Lily had tossed him aside for the thrill of something new, something forbidden. This was her consequence. The next step was a more personal one. Jake sat back in his chair and let the silence of the room settle over him. He had already decided that he wouldn't confront Lily directly. That was too easy. The confrontation would be public. She needed to face the repercussions of her actions with everyone who mattered to her. He wasn't going to let her slip away with a quiet apology. He wouldn't give her the luxury of a private, reconciliatory moment. Oh, this would be as loud and as devastating as possible. Jake took a deep breath, feeling the tension in his shoulders release just a little. He had the power now, the upper hand, and it was liberating. He began to send the evidence to a wider circle, Lily's parents or close friends, even a few colleagues who would undoubtedly find out soon enough. By the time Lily returned home that evening, the truth was already spreading. She entered the house with a smile, but it faltered when she saw Jake sitting at the kitchen table, his eyes cold, calculating. She looked at him, confusion dancing across her face. "What's going on?" she asked, but her voice wavered, and Jake could tell she had already sensed something was wrong. He didn't answer her. He simply nodded toward the phone on the table. She picked it up, her face contorting as she scanned the messages. Then the color drained from her face as the shock hit. "Jennick, no, no!" "Jennick, this isn't what you think," she began, her voice rising in panic. But Jake was done listening to excuses, done listening to her lies. Done. "I've already seen everything, Lily," he said, his voice steady but firm. There's nothing left to say. Lily's world began to crumble as the reality of the situation set in. Jake watched her try to gather her composure, but she couldn't. You lost everything, Jake said softly, the finality of it almost a whisper. And now I'm walking away, but I had my sister. So what else? What else do I have, man? Tell you this. Lily stood there, paralyzed by the realization that her betrayal had been exposed, her carefully constructed life falling apart around her. And as Jake walked toward the door, toward his freedom, he knew that there would be no going back for either of them. The silence in the house was oppressive. Lily stood frozen in the kitchen, the phone still clutched in her trembling hands. The world had shifted beneath her feet, the ground now an unstable, jagged thing that threatened to swallow her whole. The weight of Jake's words pressed down on her chest, suffocating her. You lost everything. The finality of it echoed in her ears, drowning out everything else. She had never imagined it would end like this. Oh, she had suspected for weeks, even months, that something was off, that Jake's patience, his quiet demeanor, could only stretch so far. But she had always believed she could control the narrative, that she could keep up the facade. She had never thought Jake would actually confront her, never considered the possibility that he would choose to tear her life apart in the most public, devastating way possible. She had thought the affair was a fleeting thing, a momentary escape from the suffocating routine of their marriage. David had been thrilling, an adventure that rekindled the fire she thought had been long extinguished. But now, that very fire was consuming everything in its path. Lily moved numbly through the house, her fingers brushing against the familiar surfaces of the rooms, as if the act of touching them could somehow return her to the woman she had once been, the woman who had believed she was invincible, untouchable. She had always prided herself on her ability to maintain control, to keep her carefully curated world in balance. But Jake had taken that control away from her in one swift, calculated move. The images, the text, the video, it was all there, undeniable, irrefutable. There was no escaping it now. Oh. Meanwhile, Jake was already on the move, walking out the door with a sense of purpose that Lily hadn't seen in years. It was as if he had shed the weight of their marriage, of the years of trust and loyalty that she had shattered. As he stepped into the cold evening air, he felt lighter than he had in months, even years. His body seemed to exhale a breath he had been holding for far too long. The weight of his decision was not an easy one, but it was the right one. And in the quiet aftermath, this small spark of freedom began to grow inside him. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed distance. The house, the marriage, the life they had built together. It was all suffocating now, a cage built by lies and broken promises. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how much of himself he had given to Lily. And for what? To be made a fool of? To watch as she sought excitement in someone else's arms? Jake's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to find a message from Sophia. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment. He wanted to tell her everything. The relief, the anger, the sense of justice that had propelled him forward. But instead, he simply replied, yes. No need for more words. The deed was done, and the consequences were unfolding as they should. He drove aimlessly for a while, the familiar streets slipping by, but none of them felt like home anymore. He ended up at a park, sitting in the darkness of his car, watching the lights of the city flicker in the distance. It felt almost surreal, like he was observing his life from the outside, disconnected from the person he had been just days ago. But as the hours passed, Jake began to think about the future, about what came next. His life, as he had known it, was no longer intact, but he was determined not to let this break him. This was not the end. It was the beginning of something new. He had always prided himself on his ability to stand on his own, and now he would rebuild his life from the ground up. No more lies, no more pretending. It's the truth, raw and unflinching. Back at the house, Lily was unraveling. Her parents had called, her friends had texted, and Rachel had gone silent. She had no idea what to do with herself. The carefully curated image she had built, the perfect life she had spent years constructing, was in ruins. Her marriage was shattered. Her reputation, Once the envy of everyone in their social circle now lay in tatters, she stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. Who was she now? The woman who had committed the unforgivable? The woman whose mistakes would be the topic of whispered conversations for years to come? Or was she still the woman who once loved Jake? The woman who had believed in their future, in their family, in the promise of something lasting? Lily didn't have the answers. She couldn't even find the strength to look at the photos of Jake and their children that lined the hallway. She had betrayed them all, and now she was left to pick up the pieces of a life she had so recklessly destroyed. 2 hours passed before she finally reached out to Jake. She didn't know what she expected. An apology, forgiveness, some sign that maybe, just maybe, she could make things right. But when she picked up the phone, the only thing she could hear on the other end was the steady beep of his voicemail. He had already made his choice, and it was final. For a brief moment, she considered calling David, but the thought quickly faded. He had always been just a temporary escape, a fleeting moment of excitement. The man she had once thought could offer her the life she craved, it already turned cold. He hadn't even reached out to her since the messages started circulating. Lily felt a crushing sense of loneliness envelop her. She had everything, and now she had nothing. Jake, on the other hand, wasn't lonely. He was free. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe again. He had reclaimed his dignity, his self-respect. And that, he realized, was worth more than any life he had once thought he wanted. The storm had passed, and now the calm was something Jake had to learn to navigate on his own, but stronger than before.